Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Maushmi Das, and today I'm going to be finishing up the topic of anatomy of ear. So today we'll be discussing about the anatomy of the inner ear, which is the last portion left. So let's start our class now.
So today in our class we'll be discussing about the anatomy of the inner ear. So the inner ear or the labyrinth is a very important organ of hearing and balance. It consists of a bony and a membranous labyrinth. And the membranous labyrinth is filled with a clear fluid called the endolymph, whereas the space between the membranous and the bony labyrinth is filled with perilymph. So, there are two inner ear fluids, one is the endolymph and one is the perilymph, and the membranous labyrinth is surrounded by the bony labyrinth. So, the inner ear, what is its important in the functioning and the conduction of sound? The inner ear, what it does is, it collects, packages and delivers sensory information related to hearing via the cochlea and the balance via the vestibular system. So, the cochlea is mainly involved with hearing and the vestibular system is involved with balance. The inner ear is also responsible for mechanico-electrical transduction, which is basically the conversion or transduction of movements initiated by sound waves in the cochlea or by changes in the position of the head in the vestibular system into electrical signals that can then be passed to the brain along the auditory or the vestibular nerves. So, basically the inner ear is helping in converting mechanical energy into electrical energy. Next, as we saw, the inner ear consists of two parts, the bony labyrinth and the membranous labyrinth. So, first we will discuss about bony labyrinth and its different parts. So, the bony labyrinth consists of the vestibule, the semicircular canals and the cochlea as you see in the picture. So, this rounded region over here is the cochlea, this region over here is the vestibule, and these are the three semicircular canals. First, we will talk about the vestibule. Vestibule is basically the central chamber of the labyrinth. As I showed you in this picture over here, the vestibule is the central chamber of the bony labyrinth. In its lateral wall lies the oval window, and the inside of its medial wall it presents with two recesses, a spherical recess and an elliptical recess. You see over here in the picture, there is a spherical recess over here and there is an elliptical recess over here. The spherical recess lodges the saccule, whereas the elliptical recess it lodges the utricle. And below the elliptical recess is the opening of the aqueduct of the vestibule through which passes the endolymphatic duct. So, in the posterior superior part of the vestibule also there are 5 openings of the semicircular canals. So, basically what we come to know is that vestibule is the central chamber of the labyrinth, and in its lateral wall lies the oval window where the stapes footplate gets attached, and the medial wall provides with 2 recesses, one for the saccule and one for the utricle. Other than this, there is also an opening of the aqueduct of vestibule for the endolymphatic duct, and in the posterior superior part of the vestibule, it gives 5 openings for the semicircular canals. Now coming to the semicircular canals, there are 3 semicircular canals, the lateral, posterior and the superior, and they all lie at right angles to each other. So, you can see over here, this is the lateral or the horizontal semicircular canal, this is the posterior semicircular canal, and this is the anterior or the superior semicircular canal. Now, each canal, it has an ampullated end which opens independently into a vestibule, which is responsible for one of the openings as I said earlier, and it had also got a non-ampullated end. So, the non-ampullated ends of the posterior and the superior canals, they unite to form a common channel which is known as the crus commune. You can see in the picture over here, this is a non-ampullated end of posterior semicircular canal, and this is a non-ampullated end of the superior semicircular canal, and you can see how they join together to form a common channel known as the crus commune. Thus, this is the reason why 3 semicircular canals open into the vestibule by 5 openings instead of the 6 openings. This is because 2 of the canals, they unite together to form the crus commune. Next is the cochlea. So the cochlea is formed of 3 parallel compartments coiled in a spiral around a central stalk known as the modulus. The axons of the central projection of the auditory nerve that innervates the sensory epithelia and the vessels of the cochlear blood supply, which is the cochlear artery and the vein, it runs through the length of the modulus. The human cochlea, it has 2.5 turns. As you can see in the picture over here, this here is the cochlea. As you can see, there is 2.5 turns. This turns varies in different animals. For humans, it is 2.5. And around the modulus and winding spirally like the thread of a screw, there is a thin plate of bone known as the osseous spiral lamina, which divides the bony cochlea incompletely and gives attachment to the basilar membrane. And the bony bulge in the medial wall of the middle ear, remember in anatomy of middle ear, I have spoken about this promontory which is located in the medial wall of the middle ear. That is mainly formed because of the basal coil of the cochlea. So you see over here, this here is the modulus, is the central stalk of the cochlea, and this here is the spiral lamina. So the bony cochlea contains 3 compartments inside it: scala vestibuli, scala tympani, and the scala media. The scala media is the one which is known as the membranous cochlea. So in this picture over here, you can see this first region over here is the scala vestibuli, this over here is the scala tympani, and the middle portion over here is the scala media or the membranous cochlea. So the scala media, which is the central canal, it is lined by epithelia and it is filled with endolymph. This is something I already told you. In cross sections of the cochlea, the scala media is bounded by 3 walls and it appears approximately triangular in shape. So the sensory epithelium, which is known as the organ of Corti, it runs along the basilar membrane. It forms the floor of this triangle. The primary ion transporting epithelia, the stria vascularis, runs along the lateral side, and the resinous membrane forms the roof of the scala media. So this organ of Corti, which is basically the sensory epithelium of the inner ear, I will be discussing it in a separate video later, which is when I will be discussing more in details about the basilar membrane, the resinous membrane, etc. So above the resinous membrane lies the scala vestibuli. This region is the scala vestibuli, and underneath the basilar membrane, so basically this is the resinous membrane over here and this is the basilar membranes over here, and underneath the basilar membrane, this region here is the scala tympani. These 2 scala are filled with perilymph. So scala media in between is filled with endolymph. So resinous membrane is basically acting as a barrier between the endolymph and the perilymph in the scala vestibuli. So looking at this over here, you can see this is the scala vestibuli, this is the scala media in between, and this is lower region is the scala tympani. You can see how the stapes footplate gets attached over here. It is communicating with the scala vestibuli, and the sound transmission occurs through the scala vestibuli, which then connects at the region called helicotrema. This region, this apex over here is the apex of cochlea, is known as the helicotrema. This is the region where the scala vestibuli connects with the scala tympani and the sound gets conducted right over here, which ends at the round window. So basically what we come to know over here is that the scala vestibuli and the tympani, they are connected to each other at the apex of the cochlea known as the helicotrema. So the height and the width of all the 3 scala, it decreases systematically from the base to the apex of the spiral. The scala vestibuli is closed by the footplate of stapes, as I showed you. This footplate of stapes helps in separating it from the air-filled middle ear. And the scala tympani is closed by a secondary tympanic membrane. It is connected with the subarachnoid space through the aqueduct of cochlea. So sound-induced movements of the tympanic membrane, they drive piston-like in-out movements of the stapes footplate, which displaces the incompressible perilymph along the scala vestibuli then it passes through the helicotrema over here and down the scala tympani, leading to a out-in movement of the round window. So this is the in-out movement of the oval window, and this is the out-in movement of the round window. As the fluid is displaced, there is a pressure difference that forms across the scala media, which lies in between the two. So because of this pressure difference occurring in between the oval window and the round window, it leads to a pressure difference in the scala media. And this leads to a producing of the vibrational movements of the basilar membrane, which is described by von Beckesi. This travelling wave, it stimulates the sensory cells which are housed in the organ of Corti that sits on the vibrating basilar membrane. Next, we come on to membranous labyrinth. Now, the membranous labyrinth is filled with endolymph, and it consists of the cochlear duct over here, as you can see, the utricle and the saccule, the 3 semicircular ducts, and the endolymphatic duct and the sac. So these are the parts of the membranous labyrinth. So first we'll talk about the cochlear duct. The cochlear duct, also known as the membranous cochlea or the scala media, is a blind coiled tube. It is triangular on cross section. It has 3 walls. So you'll see in the picture over here, this whole thing over here is the cochlear duct. So the floor is formed by the basilar membrane. This here is the basilar membrane, which supports the organ of Corti. Organ of Corti is a sensory organ of hearing. Next is the Reisner's membrane, which separates it from the scala vestibuli. So this here is the Reisner's membrane. And third wall lies the stria vascularis, which contains a vascular epithelium and is concerned with secretion of endolymph. And cochlear duct is connected to the saccule by the ductus reunions. So this is about the cochlear duct. Next, coming to the utricle. The utricle lies in the posterior part of the bony vestibule. I already showed you there's a recess in the vestibule for the utricle. And the utricle, it receives 5 openings of the 3 semicircular ducts. And secondly, as you can see in the picture over here, this here is a utricle. So you see how it is receiving all the ducts of the semicircular canals, 5 ducts, and also it is connected to the saccule via the Utricle Saccule duct. And the sensory epithelium of the utricle is called the macula, and it is concerned with linear acceleration and deceleration. This is a very important information to remember. So the sensory epithelium of utricle is macula, and it is concerned with linear acceleration and deceleration. Next, coming to the saccule is also lying in the bony vestibule, but it lies anterior to the utricle, opposite to the stapes footplate. The sensory epithelium here is also known as macula. So for both utricle and saccule, the sensory epithelium is the macula, and this also responds to linear acceleration and deceleration. In Meniere's disease, a distended saccule, it lies against the stapes footplate, and it can be surgically decompressed by perforating the footplate. In my earlier video, when I was showing you about the ossicular articulations, stapes footplate, I showed you how the stapes footplate is very closely related to the utricle and saccule. The saccule lies at a depth of 1 millimeter from the footplate. So, in Meniere's disease, the saccule actually gets distended because of decreased absorption of the inner ear fluid. And because of which what happens, the saccule goes ahead and it lies against a stapes footplate. So this is from where you can approach it and surgically decompress it by perforating the footplate. Next comes the semicircular ducts. So there are 3 in number, and they correspond exactly to the bony canals. They open up in the utricle, as I told you. The ampullated end of each duct, it contains a thickened ridge of neuroepithelium called the crista ampullaris. Now the crista ampullaris is the sensory epithelium of the semicircular canal. So what we came to know is that The semicircular canals, their sensory epithelium is known as crista ampullaris, and for the utricle and saccule, the sensory epithelium is known as the macula. Lastly is the endolymphatic duct and sac. The endolymphatic duct is formed by the union of two ducts, which is one from saccule and one from the utricle, and it passes through the vestibular aqueduct. You see over here, this one duct from the utricle and one duct from the saccule, and it forms the endolymphatic duct over here, and it passes through the vestibular aqueduct, and the terminal part of it gets dilated to form the endolymphatic sac, which lies between the two layers of dura on the posterior surface of the petrous bone. The endolymphatic sac is surgically important because it is exposed for drainage or shunt operation and Meniere's disease. So, as you see in this pictures, we have spoken about all the parts of the membranous labyrinth. We spoke about the cochlear duct, we spoke about the utricle, the saccule, we spoke about all the three semicircular ducts, and we have spoken about the endolymphatic duct and sac. So, if we were to see it as a whole, we will see the bony structure cochlea, bony part of the bony labyrinth. It contains the membranous structure cochlear duct within it, whose sensory epithelium is the organ of Corti and whose function is basically in hearing. Second is the vestibule. The vestibule is the bony labyrinth structure which corresponds to the saccule and utricle in the membranous labyrinth, whose sensory epithelium is macule and it helps in balancing. And lastly, the semicircular canals, which is basically the part of the bony labyrinth. It contains the semicircular ducts within it, whose sensory epithelium is crista and it helps in balancing. So, this is a complete summary of the inner ear anatomy. Now that we have spoken about the anatomy of the bony and the membranous labyrinth, we lastly will talk about the blood supply of the labyrinth. So, the entire labyrinth, it receives its arterial supply through the labyrinthine artery. Now, the labyrinthine artery is a branch of the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, also known as the ICA. But sometimes it may also get from the basilar artery. So, what are the divisions of the labyrinthine artery? So, the labyrinthine artery branching from the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, it gives off a common cochlear artery and an anterior vestibular artery. The anterior vestibular artery supplies the utricle and the lateral and superior semicircular canals, whereas the common cochlear artery, it divides into a main cochlear artery and a vestibulocochlear artery. The main cochlear artery is responsible for 80% of the blood supply to the cochlea, and the vestibulocochlear artery itself again divides into two branches, a cochlear branch which supplies the rest of the 20% supply to the cochlea, and the posterior vestibular artery which supplies the saccule and the posterior semicircular canal. So, this is all about the blood supply of the labyrinth. This is the picture over here. You can see this is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery from where the labyrinthine artery has taken origin from. It divides into an anterior vestibular artery and a common cochlear artery over here. The anterior vestibular artery has supplied the utricle, the superior and the lateral canals, whereas the common cochlear artery first divides into a main cochlear artery which is giving its 80% supply to the cochlea, and secondly to the vestibulocochlear artery. And then the vestibulocochlear artery divides into a posterior vestibular artery which is supplying the saccule and the posterior canal, and another cochlear branch which is giving 20% of the supply to the cochlea. Now, the venous drainage is through three veins: the internal auditory vein, the vein of the cochlear aqueduct, and the vein of the vestibular aqueduct. All of these which drain ultimately into the inferior petrosal sinus and the lateral venous sinus. It is to be noted that blood supply to the inner ear is independent of blood supply to the middle ear and the bony otic capsule, and there is absolutely no cross circulation between the two. And blood supply to the cochlea and the vestibular labyrinth is segmental, which means what is that independent ischemic damage can occur to these organs, causing either cochlear damage, cochlear symptoms or vestibular symptoms independently. So, they do not necessarily have to be present at the same time together. There can be independent ischemic damage. So, this completes the basic anatomy of the inner ear. In my next videos, I will be covering about smaller topics on the inner ear, like inner ear fluids, the organ of Corti. If there any topic in inner ear or any other topic that you want me to be covering shortly, please write it in the comment section and I'll be getting back to you. So thank you for watching, guys, and I'll be seeing you in my next video.